Hello, this is Morel Bernard with the continuation of the story, Secret Adversary. Last words were that they retraced their steps to the moat house. As the front door swung back on its hinges, protesting loudly, Julius struck a match and examined the floor carefully. Then he shook his head. And by the way, please subscribe to the channel. Please subscribe and please share the video. Thank you. Let me proceed. I'd swear no one's passed this way. Look at the dust. Thick. Not a sign of a footmark. They wandered round the deserted house. Everywhere the same tale. Thick layers of dust apparently undisturbed. This gets me, said Julius. I don't believe Tuppence was ever in this house. She must have been. Julius shook his head without replying. We'll go over it again tomorrow, said Tommy. Perhaps we'll see more in the daylight. On the morrow, they took up the search once more and were reluctantly forced to the conclusion that the house had not been invaded for some considerable time. They might have left the village altogether, but for a fortunate discovery of Tommy's. As they were retracing their steps to the gate, he gave a sudden cry and, stooping, picked something up from among the leaves and held it out to Julius. It was a small gold brooch. That's Tuppence. Are you sure? Absolutely. I've often seen her wear it. Julius drew a deep breath. I guess that settles it. She came as far as here anyway. We'll make that pub our headquarters and raise hell around here until we find her. Somebody must have seen her. Forthwith the campaign began. Tommy and Julius worked separately and together, but the result was the same. Nobody answering to Tuppence's description had been seen in the vicinity. They were baffled, but not discouraged. Finally, they altered their tactics. Tuppence had certainly not remained long in the neighbourhood of the moat house. That pointed to her having been overcome and carried away in a car. They renewed inquiries. Had anyone seen a car standing somewhere near the moat house that day? Again, they met with no success. Julius wired to town for his own car, and they scoured the neighbourhood daily with unflagging zeal. A grey limousine on which they had set high hopes was traced to Harrogate, and turned out to be the property of a highly respectable maiden lady. Each day saw them set out on a new quest. Julius was like a hound on the leash. He followed up the slenderest clue. Every car that had passed through the village on the fateful day was tracked down. He forced his way into country properties and submitted the owners of the motors to a searching cross-examination. His apologies were as thorough as his methods, and seldom failed in disarming the indignation of his victims. But as day succeeded day, they were no nearer to discovering Tuppence's whereabouts. So well had the abduction been planned that the girl seemed literally to have vanished into thin air. And another preoccupation was weighing on Tommy's mind. Do you know how long we've been here? He asked one morning as they sat facing each other at breakfast. A week. We're no nearer to finding Tuppence. And next Sunday is the 29th. Shucks, said Julius thoughtfully. I'd almost forgotten about the 29th. I've been thinking of nothing but Tuppence. So have I, at least. I hadn't forgotten about the 29th. But it didn't seem to matter a damn in comparison to finding Tuppence. But today's the 23rd, and time's getting short. If we're ever going to get hold of her at all, we must do it before the 29th. Her life won't be worth an hour's purchase afterwards. The hostage game will be played out by then. I'm beginning to feel that we've made a big mistake in the way we've set about this. We've wasted time, and we're no forwarder. I'm with you there. We've been a couple of mutts who've bitten off a bigger bit than they can chew. I'm going to quit fooling right away. What do you mean? I'll tell you. I'm going to do what we ought to have done a week ago. I'm going right back to London to put the case in the hands of your British police. We fancied ourselves as sleuths. Sleuths. It was a piece of darn foolishness. I'm through. I've had enough of it. Scotland Yard for me. You're right, said Tommy slowly. I wish to God we'd gone there right away. Better late than never. We'd be like a couple of babes playing Here We Go round the mulberry bush. Now, I'm going right along to Scotland Yard to ask them to take me by the hand and show me the way I should go. I guess the professional always scores over the amateur in the end. Are you coming along with me? Tommy shook his head. What's the good? One of us is enough. I might as well stay here and nose round a bit longer. Something might turn up. One never knows. Sure thing. Well, so long. I'll be back in a couple of shakes with a few inspectors along. I shall tell them to pick out their brightest and best. But the course of events was not to follow the plan Julius had laid down. Later in the day, Tommy received a wire. Join me in Manchester, Midland Hotel. Important news. Julius. At 7:30 that night, Tommy alighted from a slow cross-country train. Julius was on the platform. Thought you'd come by this train if you weren't out when my wire arrived. Tommy grasped him by the arm. What is it? Is tuppence found? Julius shook his head. No, but I found this waiting in London. Just arrived. He handed the telegraph form to the other. Tommy's eyes opened as he read. Jane Finn found. Come. Manchester Midland Hotel immediately. Peel, Egerton. Julius took the form back and folded it up. Queer, he said thoughtfully. I thought that lawyer chap had quit. My train got in half an hour ago, explained Julius, as he led the way out of the station. I reckoned you'd come by this before I left London, and wired accordingly to Sir James. He's booked rooms for us, and will be round to dine at 8. What made you think he'd cease to take any interest in this case? Asked Tommy curiously. What he said, replied Julius dryly. The old bird's as close as an oyster. Like all the darned lot of them, he wasn't going to commit himself till he was sure he could deliver the goods. I wonder, said Tommy thoughtfully. Julius turned to him. You wonder what? Whether that was his real reason? Sure, you bet your life it was. Tommy shook his head, unconvinced. Sir James arrived punctually at 8 o'clock, and Julius introduced Tommy. Sir James shook hands with him warmly. I'm delighted to make your acquaintance, Mr. Beresford. I've heard so much about you from Miss Tuppence. He smiled involuntarily. That it really seems as though I already know you quite well. Thank you, sir, said Tommy with his cheerful grin. He scanned the great lawyer eagerly. Like Tuppence, he felt the magnetism of the other's personality. He was reminded of Mr. Carter. The two men, totally unlike so far as physical resemblance went, produced a similar effect. Beneath the wary manner of the one and the professional reserve of the other lay the same quality of mind, keen-edged like a rapier. In the meantime, he was conscious of Sir James's close scrutiny. When the lawyer dropped his eyes, the young man had the feeling that the other had read him through and through like an open book. He could not but wonder what the final judgment was, but there was little chance of learning that. Sir James took in everything, but gave out only what he chose. A proof of that occurred almost at once. Immediately the first greetings were over, Julius broke out into a flood of eager questions. How had Sir James managed to track the girl? Why had he not let them know that he was still working on the case? And so on. Sir James stroked his chin and smiled. At last he said, "Just so. Just so. Well, she's found. And that's a great thing, isn't it? Eh? Come now. That's a great thing." "Sure it is. But just how did you strike her trail? Miss Tuppence and I thought you'd quit for good and all." "Ah." The lawyer shot a lightning glance at him, then resumed operations on his chin. "You thought that, did you? Did you really? Dear me. But I guess I can take it we were wrong," pursued Julius. "Well, I don't know that I should go so far as to say that, but it's certainly fortunate for all parties that we've managed to find the young lady." "But where is she?" demanded Julius, his thoughts flying off on another tack. "I thought you'd be sure to bring her along." "That would hardly be possible," said Sir James gravely. "Why?" "Because the young lady was knocked down in a street accident and has sustained slight injuries to her head. She was taken to the infirmary and on recovery in consciousness gave her name as Jane Finn." I hear that. I arranged for her to be removed to the house of a doctor, a friend of mine, and wired at once for you. She relapsed into unconsciousness and has not spoken since." "She's not seriously hurt?" "Oh, a bruise and a cut or two, really, from a medical point of view. Absurdly slight injuries to have produced such a condition. Her state is probably to be attributed to the mental shock consequent of recovery in her memory." "It's come back," cried Julius excitedly. Sir James tapped the table rather impatiently. "Undoubtedly, Mr. Hershmeyer, since she was able to give her real name." "I thought you had appreciated that point. And you just happened to be on the spot," said Tommy. "Seems quite like a fairy tale." But Sir James was far too wary to be drawn. "Coincidences are curious things," he said dryly. Nevertheless, Tommy was now certain of what he had before only suspected. Sir James's presence in Manchester was not accidental. Far from abandoning the case, as Julius supposed, he had by some means of his own successfully run the missing girl to earth. The only thing that puzzled Tommy was the reason for all his secrecy. He concluded that it was a foible of the legal mind. Julius was speaking. "After dinner," he announced, "I shall go right away and see Jane." "That will be impossible, I fear," said Sir James. "It is very unlikely they would allow her to see visitors at the time of night. I should suggest tomorrow morning about 10 o'clock. Julius flushed. There was something in Sir James which always stirred him to antagonism. It was a conflict of two masterful personalities. All the same, I reckon I'll go round there tonight and see if I can ginger them up to break through their silly rules. It will be quite useless, Mr. Hershmeyer. The words came out like the crack of a pistol, and Tommy looked up with a start. Julius was nervous and excited. The hand with which he raised his glass to his lips shook slightly, but his eyes held Sir James's defiantly. For a moment, the hostility between the two seemed likely to burst into flame, but in the end Julius lowered his eyes, defeated. For the moment, I reckon you're the boss. Thank you, said the other. We will say 10 o'clock then. With consummate ease of manner, he turned to Tommy. I must confess, Mr. Beresford, that it was something of a surprise to me to see you here this evening. The last I heard of you was that your friends were in grave anxiety on your behalf. Nothing had been heard of you for some days, and Miss Tuppence was inclined to think you had got into difficulties. I had, sir. Tommy grinned reminiscently. I was never in a tighter place in my life. Helped out by questions for St. James. He gave an abbreviated account of his adventures. The lawyer looked at him with renewed interest as he brought the tale to a close. You got yourself out of a tight place very well, he said gravely. I congratulate you. You displayed a great deal of ingenuity and carried your part through well. Tommy blushed, his face assuming a prawn-like hue at the praise. I couldn't have got away but for the girl, sir. No, Sir James smiled a little. It was lucky for you she happened to, take a fancy to you. Tommy appeared about to protest, but Sir James went on. There's no doubt about her being one of the gang, I suppose. I'm afraid not, sir. I thought perhaps they were keeping her there by force. But the way she acted didn't fit in with that. You see, she went back to them when she could have got away. Sir James nodded thoughtfully. What did she say? Something about wanting to be taken to Marguerite. Yes, sir. I suppose she meant Mrs. Vandermeyer. She always signed herself Rita Vandermeyer. All her friends spoke of her as Rita. Still, I suppose the girl must have been in the habit of calling her by her full name. And at the moment she was crying out to her, Mrs. Vandermeyer was either dead or dying. Curious. There are one or two points that strike me as being obscure. Their sudden change of attitude towards yourself, for instance. By the way, the house was raided, of course. Yes, sir, but they'd all cleared out. Naturally, said Sir James dryly, and not a clue left behind. I wonder. The lawyer tapped the table thoughtfully. Something in his voice made Tommy look up. Would this man's eyes have seen something where theirs had been blind? He spoke impulsively. I wish you'd been there, sir, to go over the house. I wish I had, said Sir James quietly. He sat for a moment in silence, then he looked up. And since then, what have you been doing? For a moment Tommy stared at him, then it dawned on him that of course the lawyer did not know. I forgot that you didn't know about Tuppence, he said slowly. The sickening anxiety forgotten for a while in the excitement of knowing Jane Finn, was found at last swept over him again. The lawyer laid down his knife and fork sharply. Has anything happened to Miss Tuppence? His voice was keen-edged. She disappeared, said Julius. When? A week ago. How? Sir James's questions fairly shot out. Between them, Tommy and Julius gave a history of the last week in their futile search. Sir James went at once to the root of the matter. A wire signed with your name. They knew enough of you, both for that. They weren't sure of how much you had learned in that house. Their kidnapping of Miss Tuppence is the counter-move to your escape. If necessary, they could seal your lips with a threat of what might happen to her. Tommy nodded. That's just what I thought, sir. Sir James looked at him keenly. You had worked that out, had you? Not bad. Not at all bad. The curious thing is that they certainly did not know anything about you when they first held you prisoner. You are sure that you did not in any way disclose your identity? Tommy shook his head. That's so, said Julius with a nod. Therefore I reckon someone put them wise, and not earlier than Sunday afternoon. Yes, but who? That almighty, omniscient Mr. Brown, of course. There was a faint note of derision in the American's voice, which made Sir James look up sharply. You don't believe Mr. Brown, Mr. Schmeyer? No, sir, I do not, returned the young American with emphasis. Not as much, that is to say. I reckon it out that he's a figurehead, just a bogey name to frighten the children with. The real head of this business is that Russian chap, Kremenin. I guess he's quite capable of running revolutions in 3 countries at once if he chose. The man Whittington is probably the head of the English branch. I disagree with you, said Sir James shortly. Mr. Brown exists. He turned to Tommy. Did you happen to notice where that wire was handed in? No, sir, I'm afraid I didn't. Got it with you? It's upstairs, sir. It's in my kit. I'd like to have a look at it sometime. No hurry. You've wasted a week. Tommy hung his head. A day or so is immaterial. We'll deal with Miss Jane Finn first. Afterwards, we'll set to work to rescue Miss Tuppence from bondage. I don't think she's in any immediate danger. That is so long as they don't know that we've got Jane Finn and that her memory has returned. We must keep that dark at all costs. You understand? Join me, Morel Bernard, for the next video of Secret Adversary. Oh, trouble. Join me in the next video for the next video of Secret Adversary. I'll see you then. Okay, bye.